As I speak to you in the name of God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Jesus gives us a command at the end of this passage. It's also an invitation. It's a vocation. When I read verses like that, I often wonder to myself how it is that anyone who is a baptized Christian could wake up in the morning and say, I don't know what to do with my life. It's not that we don't have options. And if when you ask that question, what you mean is there are different things I could do, then I totally get it. I have that question for myself on any given moment. But it's not about making decisions between options. What I mean is every baptized Christian hears from the mouth of Jesus even this morning that if we're looking for a reason to be in the world at all, Jesus offers us one. He says, you are witnesses. Now, a lot of you say, I don't get a healthcare plan with being a witness. So there's a couple other things I'm working on. I get it. A vocation is not the same thing as a job. Though unfortunately, even in the church, we've so mixed the two that we lose the fact that baptism isn't going to give you a 401k. Because a 401k doesn't last long enough for what baptism gives us. Eternal and abundant life forever. That's what we have. But here's the question. How are you a witness? I mean, a lot of us think of trials because we see so many of them on television, that if you're a witness, you're somehow a part of something awful. You wouldn't be a witness if there hadn't been a crime. So we have to pry the word witness away from, even in the last week and the last weeks, how we might associate the word witness with someone who has witnessed something horrible. We very rarely have a trial and bring in witnesses, expert witnesses on joy, and have someone's CV read out loud in court, 30 or 40 years of publishing papers and books and conferences, all that they've studied about joy. Those are not the kind of witnesses that we hear from. But the number of people who are baptized far outnumber the number of people who are expert witnesses on crime. We just have to be witnesses louder, which doesn't necessarily mean talking, but we'll get there. One of the things I don't really understand about why the lectionary has decided to give us this particular passage is that it leaves out, if you go look in Luke, the few lines just before it, and the stories really go together. And I'm sure many of you know the lines that just came before what we heard today. And it's the story of the road to Emmaus. Remember that story? That all the events of what we call Holy Week had just unfolded in Jerusalem. And the story says there were two men who were walking the 7-mile journey back to where they lived, Emmaus, on a road. You see where we get these things? So the two men were on this road to Emmaus, and they're very distraught. They were followers of Jesus. In fact, I'll tell you in a second, they were actually more than that. And then Jesus arrives to them. And the reason I would say that they're a little more than that is we get the names of one of the dudes walking on the road. His name is, you could call Cleopas, or Clopas is the traditional understanding of his name. And the Bible gives his name as one of the two dudes walking. Now, why that matters is Clopas is married to a woman named Mary. She was one of the Marys who was both at the cross and at the tomb. His wife saw this up close. But the other thing you should know about Clopas, do you know who his brother was? Joseph, the husband of Mary, the mother of God. Joseph is his brother. So this is why it's completely insane that Clopas and the other dude, who we never get his name, when Jesus comes to them, he doesn't recognize them. How could Clopas not recognize Jesus? Not only has he been a follower, in their culture, that's his nephew. That's the son his brother raised, and he doesn't recognize him. So lesson number one for us this morning: when you're stressed and afraid and betrayed and confused, it's very hard to recognize anybody, much less where Jesus is in your life or mine. Now we have all kinds of words for this that really matter. When we talk about toxic stress or generational trauma, they're all different. We even have the math for this. We know the levels of cortisol or adrenaline that can move in our minds when we become afraid. We literally lose peripheral vision. They can test that. You do not see things that you don't have to see right in front of you when you're under stress. Clopas does not recognize the boy he helped raise, who has now been raised from the dead. In fact, they talk all the way to the house. But here's the second thing that's so great about that story and the one today. They follow almost the same template. Jesus meets the people on the road, just like he comes into this room in our passage today. And you maybe know the story of Emmaus. Jesus says to them, kind of, how are you? What's going on? They're like, what's going on? I don't know. Maybe someone claiming to be the Messiah was just slaughtered in public. And I have my wife and a couple of other women. Remember, it's called nonsense. That's what they called it when the women came back to the tomb and told the guys, come from the tomb, told the guys what they saw. They called it the nonsense of the women. So Clopas is still probably in the doghouse because he said his wife was babbling nonsense. On the other hand, the body is gone. But they say to Jesus, how do you have not heard these things? So Jesus hears them out, and then he begins to say, why are you so confused? And I love this. What a Bible study. They say Jesus said to them, basically, remember the stories of the scriptures. And the passage says he goes through all the scriptures. Must have been a long 7-mile walk. And then the men said, were not our hearts burning within us while he was explaining the scriptures to us? The whole story of the Messiah, that he would come, that he'd be rejected, that he'd be betrayed, that he would be tortured, that he would be given over, that he would die, and that he would raise that temple on the third day. They're so entranced by his story, they invite him to come to a meal. And Jesus, you know this part, right? Sits before them. And then it says, he took the bread and he gave thanks and he broke it. And when he broke it, they recognized him in the breaking of the bread. And then he vanishes. I hope you recognize right there, that is like our Eucharistic prayer. And I just want to say this. Quite often people think that religion is a set of rituals that we sort of inherit, and some of them are kind of recent and some of them are not so recent, and where do they come from? And maybe some of them are based in white supremacy or racism or patriarchy. And I don't need to tell some of you that in this church, we just take apart so many of the things we've inherited, and we don't know what to trust. It's kind of like looking at the Constitution. You know, what can we read a document that they didn't believe that all people were actually people? So we're doing the same thing in the church. But what can happen is we think that what we're doing now is somehow disconnected or so far distant from Jesus. I hope you recognize that it was actually like going to church. He meets people on the road and says, how are you? What's going on in your life? That's the prayers of the people. In the passage today, he begins by saying, peace be with you. That's how he begins his visit. And by the way, what happens is when he comes to the end of the story in Emmaus and he vanishes, I don't know why we don't read this today. Those two men run to Jerusalem and go tell the 11 who were hiding that they just saw Jesus at Emmaus. And that's where the passage begins today, is when they come in. Now those men are hearing another testimony. These guys are out of breath. They've just come from Emmaus saying, we just saw the Lord, but he vanished. So people start saying, well, maybe he's a ghost. I mean, if you just saw him and he vanished. It's funny how they called the women nonsense, and the guys are like, let's find out how we make this work. So I think he was a ghost. And then we get the passage today. Jesus shows up to them. So Jesus comes to them and says, peace be with you. And he begins to ask them how they are, just like in the first passage. He says, why do you have doubts? Why do you have fears? And then it says, just like Emmaus, he leads them through all the scriptures again and reminds them that what happens is that people receive forgiveness of sins. So think of these as all Lego pieces that Jesus lays out, that we have put together the liturgy we're about to finish together right here on Zoom. That there's Jesus saying, peace be with you. There's finding out how people are, what's happening. That's called the prayers of the people. Then there's Jesus giving the reassurance that sins will be forgiven. That's our confession and our absolution. There's Jesus telling the grand story found in the scriptures. That's the reading of the word that we do. Then there's the actual forgiveness that Jesus gives to them and shows them his hands and says, touch my wounds. That is our Eucharist. We reach forward with our hands and we receive the body of Jesus Christ. My friends, think how long we have been doing that, those pieces put together in our liturgy. It doesn't mean things don't need to change. It doesn't mean we have to rethink what we meant by a person or a woman or a child or a stranger. We have to keep thinking of these things. But keep in mind that 1,800 years before the Wright brothers flew a plane, 1,600 years before Michelangelo was making beautiful stuff, 1,500 years since Isaac Newton gave us physics, which allowed a lot of other things to happen. 1,400 years since Galileo told us how the planets spin. 1,200 years since Sir Francis Bacon, through dissection, declared that women were actually human beings. 1,200 years before that, people were going to church with the same elements that we do now. So as we prepare for the Eucharist today, remember the story we're following comes right out of our gospel today. We haven't just made church up as some sort of modern religious ritual. We are doing exactly what Jesus did, which means he is in our presence. So that's your challenge. What does it mean to be a witness? It means to show up to church as best we can, whether it's Zoom or in person. Show up because Jesus meets us. That's the great message of this passage. Jesus will meet us on the road, in the room, in the church, on the Zoom. Jesus shows up. Don't fall into this thing that Christianity is a group of ideas about a person who used to live. It is Jesus coming into our presence. That's why we have candles lit, to represent Jesus is actually here. This is why people called it nonsense when the first women said they'd seen him. So I'm inviting you all to nonsense. Stop being so rational, making sure that the story of your faith makes sense to people that don't share it. Think about that for a second. So let's rejoice as we say the Our Father today, as we say our closing prayers, as we say our sending prayers, rejoice that we are doing something that has been done for 2,000 years, and we're doing it because Jesus said, do this. This is what it means to be a witness. I want to show you just a few pictures before I go about a little levity, what it would look like to find Jesus and believe that Jesus can show up right where you are right now, whatever room you're in right now. Look up at the ceiling. You got the four corners. Maybe it's a funky room. You have more than four corners. Do you believe that Jesus can arrive in that room? Are you willing to dare that nonsense that we promise to believe in the creed? This past week, I must admit, I was in Harry Potter World in Orlando, Florida. I took a trip with my best friend, who's a priest, who was celebrating all the liturgies. I think he did 30 for the 2 weeks involving Easter. And the way he wanted to celebrate as a big Harry Potter fan is to go to Orlando. So we went down there. I don't ride roller coasters. I've never been on a roller coaster. I'm terrified. I don't know why anyone pays for stress. Makes no sense to me. On their hand, I love sitting there. I cheer for people. I pray for them as they go upside down and stuff like that. So he goes on all the rides, and I just sit and people watch and have great conversations with people. We've done this for years. He goes on the Hagrid ride. If you haven't read Harry Potter, don't worry. God still loves you. But anyway, this ride is about a gamekeeper who lived at a boarding school in his own little hut. And when you go to get on this roller coaster, which is about flying around the magical world of Harry Potter, you pass by a version of his hut. Now, my best friend, is a priest. He's sort of a fancy Anglo-Catholic priest, and he's a huge Italian gay man. He's fantastic. He goes on to the ride and texts me a picture. He loses his mind. I'll use that phrase. And here, I'm going to share this screen with you. And this is going to be our, our sending image. So he sends me this picture. Can you all see that? This is, as you're approaching the ride, there's the little hut of what's called the gamekeeper of this ride. And when he gets closer, I'll show you. He shows me this picture that they have the windows. Now look closely. Those are windows. Okay. I didn't know why my friend was freaking out. Then he zoomed in. These windows are made with pieces of stained glass from somewhere. And he found the word orate. Do you see that word there? O-R-A-T-E. That's a Latin command. It means to pray. And my friend lost his mind. Then, right next to it, there is a picture of the face of Jesus. In the Harry Potter ride, in Hagrid's hut. What happened was my friend literally is all caps in the text, like screaming, Jesus is here. I had no idea what my friend was talking about. He just keeps saying, Jesus is here. Jesus is here. Now, the truth is my friend says that all the time. So I wrote back, I know, Jesus is there. He's also here. He's online with me. I'm going to go get some butterbeer. He's here. He's everywhere. My friend was like, no, Jesus is actually here. So my friend talks like this all the time. And I said, yes, I know, Jesus. Jason, I love you so much. Why is this an update? Jesus is here. Finally, he just like scream texts and then sends the picture. He was like, no, actually, the Lord's face is in line with me. And I looked at that picture and thought, someone somewhere who built this ride, which was $350 million to build, someone put in that window an image of Jesus and a command to pray. Who did that? Now, when Jesus says be a witness, that can be different for every person, but I found how that person answered. I'm going to jam the face of Jesus into one of the most popular rides on the face of the earth. And my poor Italian priest friend almost had a nervous breakdown. He said, I can't even go on the ride. I just want to talk to him. I was like, talk to Jesus, go on the ride, and come back and we'll say some prayers, which we did. We thanked God for the person that did it. We prayed for every person who'd ever see that face. We thanked God that we'd seen the face to remind us that we're in the world not to ride roller coasters, but to be witnesses to the whole story. And how are you a witness today? You are showing up to the very set of rituals given to us by Jesus of Nazareth. You're a witness already because you're here. Nicely done. The question is, by about noon today, what's next? Amen.